Welcome to a new episode of Leipzig Studies in Religion. In this series, we present publications by researchers from the Institute for the Study of Religion at Leipzig University.
Today, we are diving deep into a really central academic question. How exactly do we write a truly global history of religion?
And to do that, we're unpacking a recent article by Professor Christoph Kleine.
That's right. He's the professor of the history of religions at Leipzig University.
The article is titled From the History of Religions in Asia to a Global History of Religion. And it's really a reflection on the pioneering work done by Karenina Colmar-Pollens and others in reshaping the field.
And this piece, it's quite recent, was published in 2024. It appeared in the journal Augustus 3-2 special issue.
Okay, and that was in a collection titled Towards a Global History of Religion, Reflections on Karenina Colmar-Pollens' Lamas and Shamans.
Edited by Anja Kirsch and Andrea Rota.
All right, let's unpack this. Our mission for this deep dive is to get to the heart of Kleine's argument. Because right now, the field of global religious history is facing this methodological tension.
Almost a tug of war, you could say.
Exactly, between two big intellectual movements. On one side, you have this modern-centric conceptual genealogy, and on the other?
On the other, you have the polycentric study of pre-modern, non-European knowledge systems.
And Kleine is asking, are these two approaches just incompatible? Or do they have to become partners to create a cohesive history?
And that tension is absolutely crucial to understand. To get the context, you kind of have to look at where this whole debate came from. It grew partly out of the Arbeitskreis Asiatische Religionsgeschichte, that's the AKR working group in Germany, founded way back in 1998.
And their initial goal was pretty strategic, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. They were fighting the marginalization of the history of religions in Asia within German academia. They wanted it to be taken more seriously.
And that focus, it led them to ask some pretty game-changing questions. I'm thinking of their 2010 conference.
Yes. The big question there was, is religion a European invention?
And if you start to answer that question seriously, I mean, you fundamentally have to reshape how you study religion on a global scale.
Exactly. And Kleine's article is a direct reflection on how researchers like Pollens, people call her Nina, have tried to move the discipline past that, that European-centric starting point.
But in doing so, two very distinct methodologies have kind of crystallized.
They have.
So let's define them. Let's start with current one. The modern-centric entangled history. This is the one people often call the Heidelberg School.
Right, associated with researchers like Michael Bergender and Julian Strube.
So what's their fundamental premise?
Their premise is that the global concept of religion, as we know it, and the discourse around it, it didn't just appear in the West and get, exported.
Okay.
Instead, it's the product of entangled historical processes that primarily, and this is the key part, gained decisive momentum in the second half of the 19th century.
So it's a modern phenomenon.
It's a modern phenomenon. And their main tool for studying it is conceptual genealogy. They trace the term and its usage backward from today.
What are they trying to avoid with that approach? What's the goal?
They're trying to overcome what Bergender called regionalisiertes Ursprungsdenken.
That's a bit of a mouthful.
It is, but it's a key piece of jargon. Essentially, it just means the presupposition that the concept of religion must have a single static origin in the West.
Like it was born during the Enlightenment or something.
Exactly, and genealogy fights that. It shows the concept is actually unstable and was constructed globally.
That makes sense. So they see the meaning of religion as always being negotiated. And here's the key insight for you, the listener. This approach insists that actors outside the West weren't just passive.
Not at all.
They were actively and often decisively participating in defining and fixating what this global concept even meant after the 19th century.
Yes. Think of it as a huge late 19th century intellectual argument where everyone was at the table contributing to the definition. But that modern starting point is precisely what the second current critiques.
Which brings us to current two, the polycentric multi-perspective approach, championed by Colmar-Pollens. How does she challenge the Heidelberg School?
Well, Nina argues that if you restrict the focus to the 19th century and this West and the rest interaction, you ignore huge historical realities.
What specifically?
Specifically, crucial intra-Asian entanglements. The interactions and debates that happened among Asian cultures, which generated their own sophisticated analytical concepts long before intense global modernity arrived.
So if the genealogists only trace back this European-derived word, religion, They completely missed these non-European knowledge systems that had already been creating their own complex ideas for
Right.
centuries.
If you only look for the European term, you might mistakenly think that, abstract concepts for classifying religious traditions were just absent in 17th century Asia.
Which they weren't.
Not at all. Kalmar-Paulins's research on historical Mongolian societies is a great example here. She shows how a comparative terminology emerged autonomously, just from local actors interacting and reflecting. They were already developing what we might call an analytical domain of religion on their own terms.
So her goal is really to relinquish Europe's primacy in this story.
Yeah.
To equitably incorporate both European and non-European analytical perspectives.
Yes. Her starting point is that the ability to create systems of classification, these secondary orders of knowledge, is not some exclusive European invention.
So you can really see the difference in starting points. Heidelberg starts from the globalized modern term and goes back to the 19th century. And Nina starts from pre-modern indigenous concepts and traces them forward, often independent of any Western involvement. It feels like a clean break between them.
It seems like it. And that brings us directly to Kleine's central argument.
Which is that these two approaches are not only compatible,
but that their combination is absolutely essential for building a truly comprehensive global history of religion. They have to work together.
Okay, but that immediately raises a huge methodological question, one that Kleine directs right at the modern-centric school.
It does. If the rule of critical genealogy is to trace the continuous chain of the term religion back, and that term only appears globally around, say, 1866, why should genealogists even bother with pre-modern, non-European knowledge systems?
By their own definition, they fall outside the trace.
They fall outside the trace. It's a massive methodological bind. If your method forces you to stop when the European term disappears, you inadvertently exclude all the local history that fed into the global concept in the first place.
And Kleine says that this exclusion, even if it's unintentional, keeps us subconsciously Eurocentric.
Precisely. He points out that if non-Western actors played an active role in defining religion in the 19th century, then we have a scholarly duty to understand what they brought to the table.
We have to know what was in their toolkit.
Yes. We must identify the historical experiences, cultural imprints, epistemic structures, and conceptual resources that underpinned their contributions. If we don't know the local concepts they were drawing on, we can't truly understand their part in the global argument.
It's like trying to understand a negotiation without knowing the background of one of the main participants. You're only getting half the story.
Exactly. And that's why he uses this analogy that really makes the concept stick.
The river analogy.
River analogy. He says the concept of religion and its discourse is like a river that has various tributaries.
This is such a powerful image. So a genealogical history starts at the river's mouth today and traces it upstream.
Right, until it reaches that first major confluence. In this case, that might be 1866, when the term religion was consciously globalized.
But the history of the river doesn't just start where those two streams first meet.
That's Kleine's entire point. To understand the volume, the color, the whole path of the river, you have to follow the tributaries, the local prehistories, the indigenous concepts. You have to follow them upstream, past that first confluence.
You can't just study the moment of entanglement. You have to study the streams that were flowing into that moment. And this is where he brings in his work on Japan to show how this synthesis actually works.
Yes, his work on Japan is the perfect case study. It shows how you can combine the genealogical critique with tracing these indigenous conceptual histories. So we begin, as the genealogists do, with the contemporary global use of the term.
Which in Japanese is shukyu.
Exactly, shukyu.
Yeah.
The standard modern translation for religion. And we trace the use of shukyu backward.
To its moment of conceptual entanglement.
And that leads us very specifically to around 1866. That's when shukyu was officially used to translate the European term religion in treaties and diplomatic talks. That's the confluence.
The point where the European discourse and Japanese conceptual history consciously merged.
Right. But then Kleine says we have to ask the next question. What were the tributaries that flowed into shukyu? Before 1866, what were Japanese thinkers drawing on?
And the answer is these older indigenous terms.
The key tributaries are terms like shumon, shushi, and shush.
With those long vowel sounds again. Shiman, shushi, shushu.
Exactly. And these weren't perfect equivalents of our modern religion, but they were used all through the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. They signified things like specific schools, lineages, or comprehensive philosophical systems, most often Buddhism.
So shushi and shiman were the active local frameworks they had for analyzing and comparing systems of thought. So we have to trace the history of those terms.
And when you trace the specific tributaries, you find entanglement points that are much, much earlier.
Earlier than 1866.
Way earlier. Back in the 16th and 17th centuries, when the Jesuit missions first encountered Japan, the European term religion was already being used. But it was used by both sides as a sort of loose equivalent for existing Japanese terms like shushi or shumon. It was tightening the discursive knots centuries before.
Wait, so we're talking about concepts that can be traced back almost 1,000 years. Klein shows that the history of competing systems using these local terms can be genealogically traced back to the late 8th century.
Yes.
And those ancient 8th century concepts were still actively shaping the intellectual resources available to Japanese actors defining religion globally in 1866. That is a massive span of conceptual history.
And that is the entire point of the synthesis. Klein demonstrates that a purely modern genealogy that just stops at 1866 misses the deep cultural and epistemic structures that terms like shushi and shumon provided.
But you need both.
You need both approaches. You need the genealogical critique to anchor the discourse in modernity, but you need the history of non-European knowledge systems to understand the conceptual tools the non-Western actors were actually using.
So the conclusion of this synthesis is that the critique must include those local prehistories, the tributaries, to get the full picture. It lets us see that the concept didn't just land in Japan and stick. It merged with these deep, local intellectual currents.
That's it, exactly. Engaging with non-European knowledge systems is necessary to understand the epistemic conditions under which non-Western actors contributed. By combining the two, we get a far more nuanced and, well, a truly global history.
One that isn't just modern and isn't just focused on European origins.
Precisely.
This has been a really rigorous deep dive into Klein's proposal for synthesis. Let's try and summarize the 3 core takeaways you should leave with today.
Okay. First, Klein confirms that the 2 main approaches to a global history of religion, the modern entangled genealogy from Heidelberg and the polyocentric study of pre-modern systems like Kolmar-Pollen's, are fundamentally complementary.
They're not contradictory.
Not at all. Second, engaging with those non-European knowledge systems, like tracing shushi in Japan all the way back to the 8th century, is vital. It's the only way to understand the conceptual resources non-Western actors brought to the modern global debate.
And finally, a truly comprehensive global history has to combine both. It has to combine the genealogical critique, starting from today, with the reconstruction of those local conceptual histories.
You have to follow the tributaries upstream, past that first point of confluence. And what's fascinating is that Klein notes this method could apply more broadly.
To concepts other than just religion.
Yes. He mentions that studying local conceptualizations and historical interactions is an essential task for a global history of any concept.
And that raises a final provocative thought for you to consider. If the concept of shukut in Japan only makes sense when we follow its non-European tributaries deep into the 8th century, what other major globalized concepts like science or literature, which Klein has suggested, might we only fully understand by following their non-European conceptual tributaries just as far back into the past? Thank you for listening, and we hope to welcome you back for another episode of our series, Leipzig Studies in Religion.